and welcome to Ships, Sea and the Stars, an online webcast from Royal Museums Greenwich. And we are here to bring you incredible stories of the sea, space, history and creativity from Royal Museums Greenwich curators and special external guests. If there is a question that you'd like answered or a topic that you'd really like us to cover, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you, and you can find us by looking for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. Now, today we are dipping into fashion, politics and rebellion. And basically that means clothes. Humans are ingenious creatures, and in prehistory, we needed clothes to keep ourselves warm, to do all kinds of practical things. But of course, as far back in prehistory as we can see with clothes, they also meant something. There is a lot of symbolism that goes with them. And it carries on today. We've got fashion, even in lockdown, the catwalks are still running. People are using catwalks as a sort of walking display of art, if you like. But our attitudes to fashion are constantly changing. Our tastes are changing. And that's because the culture around us is changing. And after a year of living in lockdown, perhaps living in more comfortable clothes than we might normally, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about whether we want to go back to dressing the way we did before. So let's meet our three fabulous panelists for today. We have Sue Pritchard, who is the Senior Curator of Arts at Royal Museums Greenwich. We have Helen Person-Swain, who's an independent fashion curator and also curated the shoes exhibition recently at the V&A. And we have Alison Gowdy, who's the Curator of Art at Royal Museums Greenwich. So let's just hear a little bit from each of you about your connection to this topic. Sue, let's start with you.
Hello, Helen. Hi. I've always been interested in fashion, obviously, but I'm particularly interested in the way in which women challenge gendered norms and the way in which they use clothing, both in a very overt, but also sometimes in a very covert way to challenge those norms.
Brilliant. Alison, you can go next.
Well, I'm presenting two objects from the collection for which I'm responsible at Greenwich. I won't give too much away, but they're both works on paper, and we have a very, very extensive collection of such things at the museum. I love these objects because, unlike painted portraits and things, which tend to be a lot more formal and present, if you like, the sanctioned official image, these things sort of go slightly under the surface, and fashion plays a really, really important role in a lot of these images, and it helps us decode what's really going on behind the scenes.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Helen.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm quite excited about it. Yes, well, fashion matters. That's the whole thing about fashion. Fashion has always been used as a political tool, from, Louis XIV's red heels to Hillary Clinton's pantsuit. They've always been fashion. As a tool for not only identity, but making statements. What I'm particularly interested in is that there is also a very obvious link between political instability and a cultural preoccupation with sexual order. So mostly women get kind of caught in the middle of this. And I do find that quite interesting to explore.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we're going to start with an extract from a BBC News article, and it's from 2013. That is very relevant when you hear it. It's about a recent change in the rules in Paris, and it's read by Alex Penn.
Paris women finally allowed to wear trousers. BBC News, 4th of February, 2013. The French government has overturned a 200-year-old ban on women wearing trousers. The Minister of Women's Rights, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, said that the ban was incompatible with modern French values and laws. She said the law, imposed on November 17, 1800, had in effect already been rescinded because of incompatibility. The move to formally repeal the law followed a parliamentary question last year. According to the law, women needed to have the permission of local police if they wanted to, quote, dress like a man and wear trousers. Though it has been ignored for decades, formally it remained on the statute books. Ms. Vallaud-Belkacem said the original law had been intended to prevent women doing certain jobs. This order was aimed first of all at limiting the access of women to certain offices or occupations by preventing them from dressing in the manner of men, she said. It was modified in 1892 and 1909 to allow women to wear trousers if they were, quote, holding a bicycle handlebar or the reins of a horse. During the French Revolution, Parisian women had requested the right to wear trousers, and working-class revolutionaries became known as sans-culottes for wearing trousers instead of the silk knee breeches preferred by the bourgeoisie.
Now, I have to say, when I first saw that reading, I had to check the date again and again and again. You know, however much things get left on the statute books as ghosts. First of all, the idea that there was such a law and that it didn't go away until 2013. Just so many things with this. Sue, let's start with you. What was your reaction to this?
Well, I think women, that the issue of women dressing as men goes back to the 17th century, where you get James the First ordering his clergy to preach against women who are dressing like men. That this sense that somehow you're transgressing sexual norms because you're not dressing as a woman. And I have my own particular take on this in that when I was 13, I used to work in a street market selling groceries, and I would wear trousers and my hair would cut short. And invariably on a weekly basis, somebody would cross the road and ask me, was I a girl or a boy? And there was that sense that somehow I wasn't actually performing the role of a woman. I was transgressing the idea of what people would consider to be normality. So I've always been really interested, but I'm absolutely amazed that that was still a law still in the 21st century.
Helen, what was your reaction to this?
Well, you do know that there are discussions now in girls' schools if they're allowed to wear trousers or not. So it's still there. It's the kind of this against women, girls wearing trousers because it is seen as a very male piece of clothing, and it's still out there. This is still part of our world, which is corpse-smacking when you actually think about it. It's just I do find I don't even know where to start in a way that it is so established that still that women should not, or young girls should not wear trousers.
Although I think there have been some interesting cases recently where the boys in mixed gender schools have chosen to wear a skirt.
Yeah.
To sort of highlight the problem. So I think, you know, perhaps we're getting to the end of it. Alison, what do you think about this clipping?
Well, for me, what's really fascinating about it is not only the fact that it's stuck around for so long, even if people were ignoring it, but it takes us right back to 1800 when it was first brought into law, which is of course the aftermath of the French Revolution. This is a period I'm very, very interested in. Of course, you know, we all know the slogan of the French Revolution as being liberty, equality, fraternity. And I think this law really demonstrates the extent to which it really was fraternity, right? You know, it was all about the boys, it was all about the men. And this law preventing women from wearing trousers is, you know, the undertone of that is preventing women from engaging in the political arena. Well, I don't want to launch into my first object, but you know, that well, I think you'll see why, as a result of certain fashions and the whole connotations around them, you know, precisely what you were saying earlier, Helen, when you introduced today's session, that fashion really means something. That, well, we'll see, shall we say, why there was a revolution, why people really did react to fashion in very serious ways.
It's interesting. So I've been a tomboy basically all my life, not out of any, I've never thought about it as a political statement. It was purely a practical thing. And, you know, I was a physicist in a male, I'm a physicist still in a male dominated world and all of that stuff. And it has never occurred to me that it might be a political statement. I was just wearing what I needed to do to get my job done. And it's interesting that that in itself, apparently in retrospect, could be seen as a political statement. Okay, well, let's get straight into Alison's first object that you dropped some heavy hints out there. Now, this is a picture called Nymph of the Thames. Tell us what we're looking at here.
So this is a very rare French satirical print, and it dates from about, well, almost exactly 10 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution. So this print is dated 1779. And probably the first thing you'll notice about it is this rather magnificent headdress that the woman in the print is wearing. This enormous ship that she's got perched on top of her hair, which is a hairstyle that, or a motif, if you like, that really has become synonymous with the Ancien Regime, the old regime that was overthrown by the revolution. And it's also specifically become, I think, synonymous with the figure of Marie Antoinette, as a symbol of kind of her extravagance and her frivolity as queen. And I guess this is what I was referring to when I was saying, well, no wonder there was a revolution, you know, if people were going about wearing things like this on their heads. How absurd. And yes, it is an absurd form of headgear, and not even to, you know, start on the practicalities of wearing such a thing. But to focus, I think, on the absurdity of it, the idea of it being something that's, you know, ridiculously extravagant, does, if you like, a disservice to the women who chose to wear such things. And it obscures, if you like, the rather more serious political and historical context behind this kind of headdress. So the origin of these headdresses lies in France's support for the United States in the American War of Independence. And it refers specifically to the Battle of Ushant, and which was an indecisive battle, but there was a particular French ship called La Belle Poule, which distinguished itself in this battle. And the first examples that we know of this particular headdress are referred to as the pouf, or the coiffure de la Belle Poule, referring to that particular ship. So it was a very direct and very specific reference to a particular historical moment. And it was, far from being merely a frivolity, it was an expression of engagement with contemporary politics, awareness of contemporary politics, specifically maritime politics, which you know, was traditionally very much the preserve of men. And it was an expression of patriotism, of French patriotism, a support for the French cause against the British.
So just to be clear here, is this a type, I mean, this is a particular, the cartoon show, the caricature shows an extravagant example, but is this something that someone might actually have worn? Is this an extreme example of a thing that, you know, did anyone do their hair up to make it look like a ship? Or is it just so obvious that the symbolism and the caricature, that's what the game is?
It's a really interesting historical question, because there are, alas, no such headdresses that remain in museum collections or so on. But there are a lot of images from the period of these headdresses. Some of them are satirical, very obviously so, such as this one, but others are just examples from French fashion journals, so fashion plates. And they really are, so it's not just, you know, this specific coiffure à la Belle Poule. There's then a whole succession of different headdresses, some of them maritime, referring to other battles, but others referring to, you know, other atheaspects of the War of Independence, or other political events. There's an assumption that Marie Antoinette wore one at one point, yeah, but then, you know, it certainly wasn't limited to her, as these fashion plates demonstrate. You know, it was it was rather more widespread than that.
So let's come back to this issue of choice versus, expectation, should we say? Is it the case that, if your husband, presumably, or your father perhaps, was very clearly on one side of whichever cause it was, that a woman might be expected to wear this to support him? Or were these actually women where this was their independent way to say, well, never mind you lot, this is what I think? How did that fall?
I think it's really hard to know without concrete examples of sort of situations where you have couples, evidence of that kind of discussion or relationship. But I think it's clear that this was a way in which, certainly it would be, women of a certain class who are able to afford this kind of elaborate headdress, but the degree to which it was women's own choice as opposed to something their husband was involved with, as I say, it's hard to know without sort of concrete evidence. But I think more broadly, actually, what these are about are patriotism. So, it's more of a French thing as opposed to being on one side of the political spectrum or the other within France. And actually, what's really interesting about this particular print, you mentioned it's called the Nymph of the Thames, is that this is very much referencing the rivalry and political opposition between France and Britain at the time, obviously supporting different sides of the American War of Independence. And for me, this was what was kind of, if you like, this is what really clinched this as something that the museum should acquire, because it refers very specifically, I believe, to the so-called French-Spanish Armada of 1779, which is the year in which this print was published. And that was, well, as the name suggests, an attempt by combined French-Spanish forces to invade England, which failed, much like the Spanish Armada of 1588 against Elizabeth I.
Well,
so there's a very specific.
We'll come back to the political context. I am quite fascinated. I think you could have an armada of women turning up with these ships on their head and it'd be enough to scare anybody off. So I've got. We'll come back, Alison, to some of these themes.
I thought there is something. There is another print which is quite relevant to that subject. But,
Oh, right. The things that are in the collections. Okay, well, we're going to move on to another facet of this, which is the practicality of it, because I would have opinions about carrying something like that around on my head for any length of time. I've got opinions about high heels, but that is very relevant to Helen's first object, and this is a pair of ballet pumps. Helen, tell us about it.
So you might have seen that in the caricature of the nymph, she was wearing a pair of high heel shoes. And this was the major change, of course, after the revolution. The heels disappeared. Heels were considered to seem undemocratic, well, highly inappropriate, ridiculous, and of course, also seen as severely restricting women's freedom. So these flat kind of ballerina shoes, we kind of recall them today, but they were, well, these are evening slippers really, but they were made in kid or silk uppers with thin leather soles and these long decorative bands which you would have tied around your lower leg, and I would say, like, you know, the flat shoes, just like today, kind of promises a free movement and emulate a barefoot state in our feet liberated from the heeled footwear. But just as today, shoes that are perceived as being healthy, functional, and comfortable are not really always what they seem to be. So these kind of shoes in the early 19th century, they fell apart and were impractical for walking at any great distances. And in effect, you actually limited women completely to the domestic sphere, and whereas physically restraining as high heels. So what the message really the high heels and these flat shoes convey is exactly the same, that the wearer is wealthy enough, fashionable enough, has enough social status to lead a largely domestic life, and therefore have no need of wearing hard-wearing or comfortable shoes.
It's fascinating that you would go away from something as impractical as a high heel and end up with. So I mean, I have opinions on ballet pumps even today, I have to say, because again, I'm very active. I move about. I jump up and down a lot, even as an adult. This is fine, you know. But the point is, they just drive me mad because they slip off and they're annoying and they're flimsy and they break and they're just annoying. And it occurs to me also that, you know, in that time, I guess you would have had cobbled streets. It's not, you know, today we've got concrete things and wood floors, and this is a time when the world you were walking on was much rougher, and actually ballet flats like this, it would have been really uncomfortable.
Well,
Wow.
Just as today, wearing ballet pumps, you feel every bump, every stone, every, you know, and also what happened as today, your toes get kind of clawed because you have to keep the shoe still on your foot, and you get bruised heels. They are kind of, it gives this idea of this freedom and skipping, but actually it's even worse. And of course, in the 19th century, as you say, it wasn't even considered to be healthy activity to walk. They were supposed to be in the countryside. It was not urban spaces, because really urban spaces were really dangerous and really muddy and mucky. So you wouldn't really go out. But we do of course know, like Jane Austen, or the popular culture we have today of Austenshire, of every day being sunny and lovely and skipping about. But even the walking boots, they were wearing the walking boots. The ones we saw, of course, were evening slippers. And the walking boots were in leather or short boots, but they were still really flimsy. They're still not giving enough support. But also, as in Pride and Prejudice, if you remember that Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, when they learned that Elizabeth Bennet had walked all those 3 miles to Netherfield Park, they are shocked and completely in horror about this, which means that fashionable footwear in the 19th century did not only limit the physical movements of the gentlewoman, but it was also very clear that expectation that women should not do it either. They should not exert themselves.
And again, where was the push coming from? So, you know, if a woman did transgress, is it the case, because we've seen both, you know, women can be quite catty to other women, not to put too fine a point on it. If women are, you know, this is the oppression that is not just coming from men, it's coming from women as well, who are trying to create an expectation. So what happened to someone who if you broke these unwritten rules, who told you off? Where was the pressure coming from?
Well, I would say also it is mostly women controlling women, unfortunately, in these situations, as kind of we do see in Jane Austen's novels as well. Although they are also very the women in like Miss Bennet, she is a self-certain, confident woman and don't really care or matter about that and carry on doing it. But it was also quite a dangerous space. You wouldn't walk out on your own, and in particular not in urban places, because the robbery, violence was too much present. And go out, it was more kind of also walking out on your own, as Miss Bennet did. you took strolls in the countryside, or you went to the coast, like Brighton, where I am now at the moment. You went to Brighton or to Bath, but you went in a group. That was also the kind of thing that, as a woman, you could not walk on your own.
So in a sense that, you know, whether or not your shoes are practical is a secondary thing, because you're not going out anyway.
No.
There's no hiking up and down the, you know, the Seven Sisters along the coast or whatever. So
women were doing mountain climbing even. So, you know, there are women doing it, but in general, it is quite difficult. And it is this distinction of class, because of course there were clogs, wooden clogs, there were patterns which raised you up from the dirt and the muck. But that was women who needed to walk, to do work, who made a living had to make a living. And you wouldn't be wanted to be seen like someone who needed to make money. So it's also that class difference, which is very important.
Brilliant. Well, we will come back to some of these themes, but I want to move on to from controlling women to what the obstinate ones like me would do, who don't want to be controlled. Because I mean, it's hard to know how you would. Your culture has a lot to do with your outlook, but I find it hard to believe that I would live in a time like that and just accept it. So Sue, you've got a great example of something that someone might do if they were not on board with all of this.
So I've brought perhaps a surprising object to find in the National Maritime Museum collection, and it is a pair of seamed black stockings. And of course, black stockings have all sorts of connotations around sexual allure and fetishization, but this pair of stockings actually forms part of a Wren's uniform from 1961. And what intrigues me about this particular object is if you look at the toe, if you look at the foot of the stocking, and it has been darned in purple thread. And when I found this particular object, my first question was, why would you darn your uniform, an item of your uniform, in purple thread? Because a Wren's uniform was navy blue. It was a navy blue jacket, it was a navy blue skirt, it was a white shirt, black tie and black stockings. And we've got examples in the collection of Wren's shirts that have been darned using white thread, where they've worn under the arms, or perhaps in the bust area where the jacket has worn against the shirt. But there's been a conscious decision by the owner of these stockings to darn them in purple thread. And I think this is a rebellion, perhaps, against her uniform. In general, Wrens loved their uniform. It was smart. It gave them a sense of unity, of camaraderie, and you get history where women are saying how much they enjoyed dressing in their uniforms. But of course, the uniform itself is actually designed to be worn not at sea. It's a land-based uniform. The Wrens were formed in 1917. Their roles were very much around domestic duties, so cooking. You did have dispatch riders. You did have women who were in intelligence, but on the whole, it was land-based. It's only in terms of conflict that you've got the Wrens forming, and it's really in 1939 that the Wrens are pioneering the wearing of trousers. But of course, the trousers and the boiler suits are all designed for men, so they have to adapt their uniform. They have to take up the bell bottoms. They have to clinch the boiler suits with belts. And they're only wearing trousers and boiler suits in relation to a particular task. So women are forming part of boat crews. And of course, on boat crews, they are dressing as the ordinary ratings. But they're wearing their best, their number one suits on land. I'd like to think that this particular individual has chosen purple because it's the colours of the suffragettes. So the white, the green and the purple or violet. And the suffragettes specifically chose purple because they refer to it as a symbol of the royal blood that flows in the veins of every suffragette, the instinct of freedom and dignity. So you've got the tension here between the dignity of a uniform, but also that idea of freedom to choose to make that choice that she's going to darn in purple.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the thing about stockings in general is, well, it's not somewhere anyone's ever going to go checking. And I have to confess to some personal, so I graduated from the University of Cambridge, and there was a rule written in the university statutes that women must wear tights. And I wanted to find a way to rebel. So I found hold-ups. I'd never worn hold-ups in my life. They are very strange things. But I genuinely, there was some sort of inspection type thing, you know, my college was quite modern. They kind of got that this was, they weren't going to be too horrible about it. However, no one was going to check whether I was wearing tights or hold-ups, right? That's a part of your anatomy where, frankly, you can rebel, and unless you're very unlucky, no one is ever going to find out. Is that what we find about these, you know, these little things, that they're in places which are sort of hidden in plain view?
Yes, and I think what's really interesting about that particular set of stockings, as I say, they date from 1961. And of course, 1961, you know, tights have been invented in the 1950s. And you're on that cusp of, you know, a fashion revolution with Mary Quant and Twiggy and the miniskirt. And of course, it's entirely impractical to wear stockings and garter belts and suspender belts and girdles if you're wearing a miniskirt. So you've got that kind of tension between, on the one hand, fashion is fast forward, it's all about liberation, it's all about youthfulness and freedom. But on the other hand, you've got that sense of the uniform constricting that sense of forward fashion and liberation and being able to choose to do what you can. So those small acts of choosing to as I say, darn your stockings in a different color, it's just that slight element, however you feel about being within the context of the military and the forces and wearing a uniform, you can still enact these small acts of rebellion. And of course, what was really interesting is that wrens were wearing tights right up and wearing stockings right up until the 1970s. And it's in 1975 that the decree goes out that wrens no longer wearing stockings, that they're wearing tights. And this is considered to be, you know, the second black day for the Royal Navy. The first black day was in 1970 when the run rations were cancelled. And then the idea that the wrens were going to have to abandon their stockings and wear tights, this was considered to be the second black day for the Navy. And you get this whole campaign, fight tights, you know, because of course you still got that sense that somehow there was this sexual allure around women in their black seam stockings.
That's interesting, isn't it? So the stockings all the way through this, because I mean, today we would think of stockings as being sexualized, perhaps in a way that tights aren't. And yet the stockings were first and stayed there. That's quite interesting that it started off as, you know, a practical thing perhaps, but it finished up as actually that's a stay in you are supposed to be a woman in this type of way, wear your stockings.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. I love the idea that the purple, I hadn't appreciated that purple was the color of the suffragettes when you first showed me that object. Brilliant. So we will move on. So if you're joining us or you've joined us halfway through, this is Ship, Sea and the Stars, the online broadcast from Royal Museums Greenwich, and this week we are talking about fashion, rebellion and politics with Sue Pritchard, Alison Gowdy and Helen Pearson-Swain. Now we're going to go straight on to our contributor's second object, and Alison is up first with dresses à la Neil. We had a bit of discussion about pronunciation. So tell us what this caricature is, Alison.
So unlike the first caricature that I presented, which was very clearly a satire with a sort of quite a biting political edge, this one's rather more gentle, but no less intriguing and entertaining. So it's titled, you can see at the bottom, Dresses à la Neil or à la Nile, respectfully dedicated to the fashion mongers of the day. And this print was published in 1798, just off the back of the Battle of the Nile, which was, of course, a sort of major success for the British cause in the Napoleonic Wars, but specifically, you know, very much a personal success for Nelson. And it sparks a huge fashion for all things Egyptian, all things Nile. And this was kind of summarized, if you like, most particularly in the motif of the crocodile. So what we're looking at here is
oh, she's got crocodiles on her dress. I hadn't appreciated
yes,
that.
yeah. So this print takes the kind of traditional, or what would have been recognized at the time as a fairly standard format of a fashion print, but sort of introduces all these slightly entertaining elements. So the woman on the left, as you can see, is wearing, what might be regarded as sort of a white muslin dress, which was totally of the moment. However, it's been sort of drawn in such a way that it's reminiscent of a mummy, an Egyptian mummy. And of course, it is embellished with these rather fabulous crocodile motifs. And that's then repeated in the muff that she's wearing. It's rather large, green, fluffy muff with what is supposed to be, it's not entirely convincing as a likeness, a crocodile head, which of course is open, and inside the mouth, just to make the point, is a rather nice pun, the mouth of the Nile. And that's then repeated in her headdress, which of course says Nelson and Victory, but then these ribbons at the back which kind of flutter out quite nicely as if they're sort of an estuary or something, and they also all say mouth of the Nile. But it's not just the women that are in on this. There's also on the right side of the print a man, and he too is wearing a headdress that says Nelson and Victory. He's not wearing a ship like we saw in the previous print, but he is wearing a crocodile on top of his head. And that's then picked up and repeated in the frock coat that he's wearing, which has a kind of pattern on it that looks rather like crocodile scales. And then in his fabulous webbed boots that he's wearing. So yeah, as I say, I mean, the crocodile was kind of shorthand for the Battle of the Nile, and there's kind of croc mania everywhere. So you get crocodiles on all sorts of different objects, including, ceramics. You could buy a dinner service with Battle of the Nile crocodiles on it, but also rather more formal objects like presentation swords. Were given, that the hilt of which was in the shape of a crocodile, and we have a number of those.
So is it the case? Sorry. Is it the case that is this poking fun at the groupies basically, or is this making suggestions? I mean, is it poking fun at the concept, or is it that so we have these stereotypes perhaps in society today, like hipsters, for example, or the Justin Bieber fans, or is this poking fun at a particular group, or is it just the whole idea that everyone's gone crocodile crazy?
I think it is. I mean, it's poking fun at people that are sort of engaging in this, but to be fair, I think it was fairly widespread, and there was just a general kind of euphoria at the victory. Yeah, I think, as I say, it's a gentle satire. It's a satire that the people who are being satirized would themselves also enjoy, I think.
I'm quite I thought it was a bird on the muff. I was trying to guess what kind of estuary birds would have a beak like that. I thought we were wondering if it's trying to be an emu or something. I can see, I mean, I guess we are talking about a time when there were fewer opportunities for expression. Now we can go into an art shop and we can buy art materials, and we can, I don't know, make websites, and there's all these other ways of expression. And is this sort of example, is it partly because there aren't many other ways to express yourself, or is it just that it's a particularly good one?
Do you mean the sort of wearing of crocodile things?
If you want to, hooray for crocodiles, is it that clothes are just the most obvious way, the personal way to express yourself in a world that perhaps has fewer modes of expression?
I suppose, you know, insofar as there was no internet and so on, and no Instagram, then yes. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it was just a way in which people of actually, frankly, you know, various different social classes. So, you know, you see examples of these sorts of objects, you know, that involve crocodiles, even within the museum's collection. Of a whole range of sort of socioeconomic groups and sort of degrees of expense. So yeah, I think it's also just being part of, as I say, the general euphoria and excitement around this victory. And you know, we also have fabulous. You know, there's a letter written by Emma Hamilton to Nelson, you know, in which she refers to him sort of jokingly as Baron Crocodile. You know,
it's quite nice. It's all a bit silly, isn't it? There's often this perception that history is all very sensible and everyone did very sensible things, and actually this is just daft, and it's quite good fun because it's quite daft.
Well, I think exactly, it is just good fun. It's really good fun. And yeah, I mean, I think, and even with the sort of more biting political satires, because there were also sort of more politically engaged caricatures and things that also pick up on the idea of the crocodile. And there, the crocodile is sort of a symbol of Napoleonic France. You know, there's one example in the museum's collection of Nelson kind of wading through the waters of the Nile and slaughtering crocodiles, one for every French ship that was defeated or captured at the Nile. But
I'd take a ship over. I've met a few crocodiles. I think I'd take a ship over a crocodile. Okay, we have to leave the discussion of crocodiles for a little bit, which is a shame, I think. But never mind. But we have something even more interesting to go on to, because we've been focusing on Western clothing, on British and French European clothing. But of course, there are other cultures, lots of them, who've been experimenting with their own clothing for just as long as we have. And Helen's next object is an example of this. Now, Helen, this is a chippo. Did I get that right?
Chippo.
Tell us.
Yes. Yes. So I think everyone recognises this. The chippo, the body skimming, high-necked, with really high side splits, which is seen by many today as China's national dress. And lately, also quite a lot of raised voices about Western cultural appropriation or misappropriation of this garment. And I think with this, I wanted to talk a bit about the history of the chippo. Actually, this is a cheongsam, which is in a Hong Kong piece, but it's the object, the dress. Because from the late 1930s, the chippo became the stage in China for debates about sex, gender roles, aesthetics, and the economy, and even the nation, which is quite how one garment became so important in the ideological discussions at the time. So the chippo was the main fashion item in China during the nationalist period, which is 1929 to 1937. So together with high heels, bobbed or permed hair, the chippo was worn by what was seen as modern, liberated and free-spirited Chinese women. So the chippo became the mark, as to speak, about the emancipation among Chinese women. And this, unfortunately, came to embody un-Chinese values that the governments, both central and provisional, sought to eradicate from the cultural landscape in the later 1930s. So the chippo-wearing woman came to typify the urban decadence that was, and to be sapping the moral of the Chinese nation. One politician actually, and I have to quote this because this is, for the rise and fall of the country, women's adornment bears responsibility. So all this kind of weight was laid on Chinese women, and part of this quite heavy propaganda of not wearing. So from being modern, the chippo was considered to be a feudal style, something tainted by associations with right-wing politics and decadence. And this came to a complete top during the Cultural Revolution. Of course, women had stopped wearing the chippo before that because the risk of violence just wearing it was so high. During the Cultural Revolution, many women were forced to wear, to be put on a too small chippo and then paraded around to be humiliated, shouted at, and actually, thrown at. So the chippo kind of started being this high fashion piece to something that was used as a tool, a political tool in its murkiest sense, really. And
how did that move into the modern day? Because when I look, I know nothing of the history of this clothing. I'm very glad to be educated. But when I think of that, I think I have seen modern Chinese women wearing something like this.
Oh, yes.
So how do we get there?
So this is all mainland China. While all this was going on, in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and in Chinese communities, both in Britain or North America and Europe, that the chippo continued to be worn and developed. But in mainland China, it was completely forbidden or stopped using, and instead was a sign of or associated with right wing, not being nationalistic. And it was not until the 1990s and the return of Hong Kong in 1997 when the chippo came back with a force in mainland China again. So this is kind of that, and today, of course, also you see it in quite a lot of Chinese designers is bringing it back up again. Also, it's been of influence for contemporary Western designers, and it's here where these discussions come of cultural appropriation. I'm sure also people remember the Utah girl who was wearing a chippo to her high school prom in 2018, and it is this not knowing the past or knowing the history, I would say, of a garment. It's then when you do find these quite emotional associations to them, because knowing how women were treated during, in particular, the Cultural Revolution was have given quite big scars. Even if your grandchildren now, they are still kind of there, and they are associated with the chippo very much.
It's a fascinating topic. I'm sorry we haven't got more time to talk about it, because I think that whole thing of there's only so many ways to dress a human, so some things are going to come up more than once. And how do you distinguish between all these different meanings that we put on these different ways of getting to this one place? Anyway, we are going to have to move on because we have one more object to get to. And this one is kind of turning the question on its head. If the world is busy trying to boss you about one way or another by telling you to dress like a woman, what if you just throw that out the window and dress like a man? So Sue has a great example of this. Tell us about this sailor.
So this is basically a costume design. There are two costume designs. This is the sailor on the stage, and it has a companion, the middy on the stage. And they're costume designs from a production that was performed at the Alhambra in London's Leicester Square. The Alhambra Theatre was both set for music hall, but also light opera and ballet. And they also had these amazing spectacles celebrating the British Empire and military successes, British military successes. And they're designed by a gentleman called Lucien Bischer, who actually trained as a porcelain painter in the Staffordshire Potteries, and then decided that he was much more happier designing costumes. And the Army and Navy was basically an opportunity for the women corps de ballet to dress en travesti. And at this stage, we didn't normally have, it wasn't normal to have a principal ballerina or a female dancer. So women regularly dressed as men. And this was absolutely acceptable. And it was incredibly popular, particularly in the press. And there's a article in the Topical Times, which was dated the 6th of April, 1889. And it claimed that of all the dancers, the sailors seemed the most popular, especially a double hornpipe by Miss Thurgate and Miss Phillips. So there is this idea that women on the stage could transgress societal norms. And you get Colette in France, she regularly dresses as a sailor, Hetty King and Vesper Tilly in the late 19th and early 20th century, they're performing as men. And All the Nice Girls Love a Sailor was a particularly popular ditty for both working class men and working class women who saw these women dressed as men as being aspirational. There wasn't a problem with this at all. It was perfectly acceptable. And it also goes right back to the 1860s, where you get the beginnings of burlesque, and you get Linda Thompson, who was incredibly successful, performing again as a midshipman on stage. And she had a gang, a troupe of British blondes, and their trademark was the short trunks and shapely thighs. So this is perfectly acceptable upon the stage. But running alongside this, you've also got the rise of the rational dress movement. And you've got women who are campaigning for more suitable, more comfortable forms of fashion, particularly with the bifurcated skirt. And this is really about, more athletic pursuits. Helen mentioned mountain climbing. This is about women who want to ride bicycles, who want to go walking, and they don't want to be constricted by this, long dresses with corsets. And I think it's kind of really, there's a point at which it becomes mainstream, where you get a woman called Lady Florence Harberton, and she goes out, she's cycling in her knickerbockers, which are voluminous trousers with a skirt over the top, and she's refused entry into a coffee shop. She goes off and she wants to have coffee, she wants to have something to eat, and the landlady refuses to let her in because she's seen as a distraction. And the gentleman in the coffee shop might take offence at her wearing her knickerbockers, and she might be a focus of some ridicule, and the gentleman might complain about her not having shapely ankles. And so
what a case of victim blaming. That is fantastic, isn't it?
Exactly. So it goes to court. Lady Florence takes it to court, and the case is actually dismissed. But she emerges from the court, and she says afterwards, I admit that it's probably certain that women will never ordinarily wear knickerbockers, but mark this: short skirts for walking wear will be a boon that ought to be easily attained, and once attained, cherished, like the Magna Carta in the British Constitution.
Oh, I like that. That's very good. Next time I wear a mini skirt, I'm going to tell everybody that this is the modern equivalent of the Magna Carta. But it's interesting. So these battles, like, in a way, so I find these discussions really interesting, because on the one hand, they are horrifying, and on the other hand, from my point of view, they're almost hard to take seriously, and yet they still creep into the modern day. Like, it's this weird little triangle of how can that ever have happened, and it still happens. And we're still in the middle of this. Like, how do you see the knickerbockers of today? These, how are we properly past that battle? What's going on here?
Well, I think as Helen mentioned, it's still pertinent when you're still having these conversations about, can girls wear trousers to school? And I can remember quite clearly when I was at secondary school, I think I was in the lower sixth, and that was the point at which we were allowed to wear trousers. And I was just like, thank you, because the idea is that it's so much easier to put on a pair of trousers. You can do so much more. You're not constricted. Although, as I say, when I talked about the 1960s and the sort of sexual revolution and women wearing miniskirts, trousers still enable you to have so much more freedom.
It is fascinating. Right, we're out of time, so we're going to have to stop there, which is a terrible shame. But all of this and more is in the museum, and hopefully when it opens up again, we can dig into this a bit more. So I've got a final question for each of you, if you could answer very briefly, because we're a bit out of time. But if there was one piece of clothing or attire of some sort, could be shoes, from history that you could wear without worrying about modern, affordability and modern day fashion and all of those, what would you pick? What would you really like to wear from history? Alison, you can go first.
Well, I feel I have an obligation to my to my objects to say that, I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to wear a shit hat. I mean, that's I don't know, it's be great fun. Yeah, I'm not sure what it would mean though today. I'd have to think about that.
Well, you can buy one from Philip Tracy.
Yeah.
I mean, he created the galleon hat in 1994 for Isabella Blow, who informed him of the fashion, and so he created a galleon hat.
Brilliant. Well, I think we should put those in the gift shop for the Cutty Sark. I think
I was going to say, yeah, might be on the curatorial salary, that one.
Helen, what would you like to wear from history?
Well, I must say, after being sitting inside for 1 year, I want to go out fully dressed with a ship on my head and fully high heels. Yeah.
All the most impractical clothing.
Yes.
Okay, Sue, how about you?
Oh, it'll come as no surprise to Helen, because we both share an absolute passion for vintage fashion. I'd have a fabulous pair of silk pajamas from the 1930s.
Fabulous. Well, I'm feeling very underdressed at the moment. Brilliant. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much to all of you. That was fantastic. For the audience, we have lots more museum objects to talk about, so do keep an eye on Ship, Sea and the Stars. There's more to come. If there's a question that you'd like answered or a topic you'd like to discuss, please do let us know. Where you can find us at Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. There are lots of other episodes that we've done in the past, all available on the RMG website at rmg.co.uk/museum from home. And we are very hopeful that the National Maritime Museum, the Royal Observatory, the Cutty Sark and the Queen's House will all be open again from May. And there's lots going on in and around Greenwich before then, and you can find that at rmg.co.uk/visit Greenwich. So it only remains me to say thank you to our three fabulous and fantastically well-dressed contributors. Sue Pritchard, Alison Goody and Helen Person-Swain. Thank you to Alex Penn for the recording, to Steve Thompson for the music. James Gill was the producer, and I'm Helen Czerski. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.